Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have Philip Sheldrake with us, and it's a pleasure to have him with us because with Philip it's quite different to the other guests we had so far, some of them that I didn't have the opportunity to meet face to face, but with Philip we met in Barcelona recently at Rebooting Web of Trust, and we had a very nice conversation. And after the conference I told him, hey, it would be really great if you can come over to SSI Meetup and share some of your thinking about identity and where the world is going. And so he agreed, which is nice. And we have Philip with us here today. But before we go into the more formal presentation, we will go to slide number 2, where we quickly summarize what SSI Meetup is about. So SSI Meetup, what we are trying to do here is to empower global SSI communities, and all the material we're creating here is open to everyone. So, and anyone can participate. It doesn't matter if you're a company, a student somewhere, or someone who's interested in SSI or an academic. It's really open to everyone to reuse this material and share it. The only thing you have to respect is that it's a Creative Commons by share alike license, which basically means it's open source and you can use it in whatever way you want. You just need to give credit back to Philip in this case today and to SSI Meetup for sharing this material with you. We will be sharing all this material in a Google slide link where you will be able to download the presentation. We will be recording the video and we will be also sharing it in a slide share presentation. So you will have all the material available for you. And with if you have any questions during the presentation, please just interrupt at any moment. You have a tool here with GoToWebinar that allows you to ask questions, and I'll be bringing up those questions to Philip as he presents. Or if not, you can bring up those questions at the end of the presentation, whatever you feel like. But if you feel at any point of time that you're not following or this is something specific you need to ask, then just go ahead and ask. And Philip, thank you so much for being with us here today, and I'll look forward to listen to what you have to share with us.
Oh, thanks, Alex. Much appreciated. And hello to everyone who can join us now, and if you're listening after the fact on the recording, it's my pleasure. Hopefully, I want to share some ideas and potentially kindle some cooperation on the topics that we cover. You'll see I put a lot of emphasis on cooperation, and it's the only way that we'll succeed together, in my opinion. So here's what's coming up. Just a quick one on the AKASHA Foundation, set the scene as far as my Monday to Friday goes, and then cooperative and self-organizing, then a little bit into data, the main topic at hand, identity, and then a few things to be aware of as far as we're concerned, and then rounding off with collective minds. And we'll be rounding off with collective minds because that's part and parcel of the AKASHA Foundation's purpose. It's a non-profit. It was founded by Mihai Alisi, who is known for creating Bitcoin magazine back in the day, and then for co-founding Ethereum, of course. And the foundation's purpose describes making a significant change in the world. And I guess fundamentally, you might describe this as in terms of cooperation and self-organizing. So that's going to be the first scene setter, if you like, for this webinar. I'm fascinated by the work of Lynn Margalis. She was an indomitable and brilliant biologist, and she was the first to really start to take Darwin's work and dig deeper, particularly actually correct some of the misinterpretations of Darwin's work. Here, for example, she just simply says that cooperation rather than competition is the dominant force for life on Earth. So that's a beautiful way to set this webinar up, as you will see. Here's how I put it, right? I want to look at the work we're doing as an identity community and situate it at nothing less important than our future existence. We have to get a digital infrastructure that can help us as a species rise up to some what are known as super wicked problems collectively, because there's no way else to rise up to them. And in doing so, then we need a distributed network. I think there'll be more than a few people listening to this webinar that are into decentralization. And it demands diversity and individual agency. These are requisite for the emergence of collective intelligence. I guess throughout my work, I find I need to emphasize boundaries, and that's what we're doing here with identity. Margaret, Wheatley and Myron, Kellner-Rogers here just describe life on Earth as organizing around identity. So I just thought that was just a perfect scene setter here. It's the filter by which each organism or system makes sense of the world. We recognize it as a boundary, perceivably a delimiting of oneself from the next, one identity from the next. And at the same time, we need to accept the concurrent liminality, if you like, the irreducible, incontrovertible interweave and reciprocities. You know, the way we all need each other to survive, to thrive. And so Wheatley's work, as far as I'm concerned, situates our requirements for all things digital identity. Here, for example, is a model that emerged from her work known as the 6-circle model. So to get the best from individuals and collectivities of individuals, in order to best cooperate with our family, our neighbours, our colleagues, our compatriots, and as I said earlier, our species, we need to effect system change. System change, sometimes known simply as organising. We organise to change things. And her research demonstrates how focusing our change efforts quite typically, in other words, on the 3 circles at the top, structures, patterns and processes, which in this model are known as above the line, just focusing on those 3 red circles does not succeed without equal emphasis on the elements below the line: information, relationships and identity. This is breakthrough thinking. This, if you've ever been part of an organization that says, oh, I just don't know why we can't affect change in this business, it's possibly because the business was only looking above the green line and not below it as well. And yet that's where our focus here, identity, lies. That's the contribution that it makes. So let's look at those 3 conditions for self-organizing for cooperation a little bit more closely. We have information. And you always, whenever I talk about information or indeed data, I'm always thinking about it moving, about it flowing, rather than just being static. It only really comes to life, adds value when it's moving, when it's being combined and recombined. It's the medium of the organizing in Wheatley's term. Then we have relationships, and that's like interdepending, how we need to rely on each other to do what we need to do what we'd like to do. And these are the pathways for organizing. Then we have identity. And in brackets there I've put narrative, because again, this is about the flow, this is about movement. And this is the sense-making capacity of the organization. Interestingly, you don't have to spend long in the company of these 3 things before you realize that they are reciprocally defining. This is so essential to this webinar. I'm going to read some of this stuff verbatim because it's absolutely critical. In other words, information is contextual to individuals in relationships. That's the only way we can make sense of it. Relationships are formed with information exchange between identifying individuals in identifying organizings. So that identification aspect, it requires it at the individual level, but also at collective levels, what philosophers might call assemblages. And then, of course, identities assemble from who we know, the relationships that we're in. I'm someone's son, I'm someone's husband, I'm someone's friend, someone's neighbor. And that's what gives us our identity. What we do in those relationships. In other words, the information that we exchange in conversation, in communication. So you can't look at one of these alone. The interweave and reciprocity of these is such that in another Enlightenment age, in another language, these 3 concepts might just be various lenses on the one concept. Imagine, for example, any 2 of these without the third. I've tried it, and it just doesn't make sense. So now imagine grasping an instance of them, a snapshot, a static screenshot, if you like. If you And that doesn't make sense either, because they only live in movement as verbs, dynamic, evolving, disrupting, and transforming. And that's just where Buckminster Fuller steps up to the mark, as far as I'm concerned. This is one of the most mind-blowing sentences I read as a student, back when I thought that student was just a finite phase of my life. I've got over that now. I mean, this isn't the forum to expand on his insights more deeply, but I can say this. If verbs don't have primacy over nouns in your work in identity, then personally, in my humble opinion, I think you're going to fail. Not only that, it's going to fail others as well. There can be harm in the work that we're doing. Identity gets to the core of the human condition. But Bucky Fuller wasn't the only one to think along these lines. One of the 20th century's greatest physicists, David Bohm, also actually, I've just found out, the Dalai Lama's favorite scientist. He had a similar feel for the way in which the way in which the universe works. Here he's saying that we need to switch round from looking at objects first and then considering them in events. He's saying the event, the verb, if you like, takes primacy here. Only then can you reflect on objects. So again, I'm not going to belabor that concept any more deeply, but it's just worth noting how these thought leaders, these just genius people, were thinking about our domain without naming it. So this is the perfect segue to data. I think, if you'll allow me the narrative, to come at identity through data. How should we deal with it? How should we treat it? And how can we, if you like, bend it to our needs? So the first thing to say is we rely heavily on metaphor. Here, for example, is perhaps, from observation alone, the most dominant metaphor for how we might go about thinking of data, bearing in mind that this didn't really exist in everyday life just a few decades ago. Metaphor infects everything we do, and why else, for example, would we have the concepts of files, folders, and desktops in the digital realm? There's no need for them. We use them because we're familiar with them. And in reaction to the likes of Facebook and Google and their equivalents, there's a growing call for change framed in terms of property. It's my data, we hear. I want to take back control. Sorry, I had to insert that one because that's a little bit of a stab at the current Brexit situation here in the UK, but don't get me started on that. But here's the crux, right? Even though this is the dominant paradigm of thinking at the moment, even though Will.i.am stood up at Davos in January this year and said, data is property, I want my data, it's abhorrent. It just is not the right way to think about it. Here's a slide from a previous SSI meetup. It's wholly wrong. It's tricky to try and condense a rather long explanation that I did in a recent blog post on the topic of why data is property and therefore property is subject to markets is wrong. But I can leave you with 2 points here. The first is that markets are based on ownership of rivalrous goods, right? I can own this computer or you can own this computer. We both can't have the computer. It's rivalrous. But not only is data not rivalrous, it should actually be what's become known as anti-rivalrous. In fact, the more we share it around, the more value we can get from it as a society. In fact, I think we need it to be anti-rivalrous for the very existential reasons I noted up front. And so I just can't think of data markets. Fortunately, nor can the European Data Protection Supervisor, who in 2017 wrote this. In short, really viscerally, he said, a market in personal data is as loathsome as a market in live human organs. Now, we don't allow people to sell their kidneys. That's a bloody good thing as far as I'm concerned. And the last thing we should do is when you start to think how integral personal data is to identity, is to allow people to abdicate their rights just to afford a couple of dollars coming in, when collectively we can create so much more value than any market can assign through a price. This is a phrase that we hear quite a bit, my data. It sounds so innocuous, but as we've already seen, there's a lot of power in everyday language. My, for example, conveys two things. It conveys that I'm the subject of this data, but it also conveys that I own this data. It's my property. But as I've just tried to explain, perhaps too briefly, we can only refer to the first of these. We can't talk about my data. If you catch yourself talking about my data, you're sending out a good signal, which it's about the data's about me, but you're sending out a bad signal, which is data can be propertized. It shouldn't be. So we need to change the language and start talking about data about me. If you say that, you jettison the property analogy, the property association, the property reality. Now, this isn't alone denying so-called self-sovereignty, only the way in which self-sovereignty works in the world. It's data about me, but I still have agency over it. I still have agency through it. And collectively, it's how we become, it's how we grow, how we change. Let's have a look at some of those other metaphors that can distract us from talking about property and therefore distract us from understanding identity. Data as labour is one that's become quite popular following the Radical Markets book published at the beginning of 2018, I think. It is, as you might imagine, given that labour is something that in casual language we say we own and we can sell, and there's markets for labour. In many ways, data as labour is too similar to data as property to shortcut it for this webinar for me to feel comfortable with it. There are some other nuances, but if you read about those nuances, they make the same points as I'm going to make coming up, which is about the cooperation, the collective value that we can derive rather than one's individual labour. What's next? Well, data as reputation seems to be quite a conversational piece at the moment. What's your rating on this service? What's your rating on that service? How many likes have you got here? How many followers have you got there? Did you get 5 out of 5 or 4.3 out of 5? Oh, the difference must be really significant. And yet, these reputation scores are, at scale, quite evil. And I'm going to come back to that later on in the stack. We have to resist the interoperability of reputation. And actually, if you don't like censorship, for that reason alone, you must also resist reputation scoring. Because as soon as you know that you're being scored by powers that be, you self-censor. And that's not agency, that's not unlocking the full potential of human beings, that's not allowing them self-sovereignty in the world in order for collective intelligence to emerge. What's not to like about data as public good? Well, actually, it's part of the main thrust of what I'm trying to say in this stack. And yet, it can't just be data as public good, because data needs to serve private purposes as well. And actually, when you read the protagonists exploring data as public good, often they bend around to this idea that all we need then is the regulation of markets so that the market can be directed to delivering public good. But I've already said that markets aren't relevant, because if data isn't property, where do markets come into the equation? So as soon as you invoke market regulation, you invoke markets and data as property, and we're back to the top of the screen again. So this is proving quite tricky. There must be a metaphor here somewhere. Data is me. That's got to be it, right? We're on the self-sovereign identity call. This is me, myself, and I. It's about the information It's about, I guess, how would you put it? Well, Professor Floridi at Oxford says, in explaining data is me, you are your information. And when he says that, he's basically translating data transgressions, privacy invasions as we know them today. He's translating them, he's reframing them as acts of stealing or cloning or breeding someone else's identity. In fact, we use the word identity theft to associate identity with this loss of control over data. So this is powerful stuff, but data is me doesn't extend to the purpose I have for this webinar. It doesn't extend to the purpose of the AKASHA Foundation, because it's, as you can quite easily tell by the third of the three words, it's too individualistic. And it conflicts with the idea that we might be able to just maybe glue ourselves, bind ourselves more tightly, more coherently, more intelligently, if this data could flow more easily between us rather than it being mine and mine only. I guess what I'm saying is we need a little bit more we to balance out the me. In fact, every time I look at a metaphor for data, I find that you can't bring some of the characteristics of a metaphor over that do work without bringing all the baggage of that metaphor over that doesn't work, that confuses the picture. So often I find myself saying, look, let's just look at data as if it is unprecedented, because do you know what? It is unprecedented. There's a link there if you want to find out more about the longer story to go with this slide. So, well, you can't mention data without invoking the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, and because of its regard for the way any company in the world treats citizens in the European Union, it's got global ramifications. The interesting thing about this, of course, is it's got the word personal bang up the front. This is about the individual, or in fact, and perhaps unfortunately, if we're talking about the human condition and understanding what it means to be human, the entire data protection regulation is framed in terms of the data subject. It doesn't really have a ring about it that says, yes, we understand what it means to be human in the 21st century. It's basically saying, look, we've got this corpus of law, this is the language we use, can we see if we can fix some shit going on here? It doesn't really set out to redefine what it means to be human, to add to the psychology, the biology, the social nature of humans, add the informational, add the interfacial. It doesn't aspire to do that, even though I think that's the logical conclusion. It just speaks very clearly in terms of data subject. And yet, oddly, we're social animals. So having framed everything as personal data, we then find out that the vast majority of personal data is in fact interpersonal data. That bank account is interpersonal. It's between me and a legal person called a bank. It describes transactions between me and other persons. The genome, that's interpersonal, except I share quite a lot of it with my parents, right? So actually that turns out to be interpersonal data. Even just moving by yourself through a city, in transit, that's interpersonal data, directly in terms of whether you're going to be late or not for the coffee, but also indirectly in terms of the contribution you can and should make to others' choice of mode of travel and the route that they might take. So this is an interesting thought experiment. On one hand, we've got personal data that's quite legal, and now we've got interpersonal data, which I purport to be quite human. So let's just contrast them so that we can see where we're coming from here. So that's the first comparison that I've just made. That's another one I've made, but I've put a plus at the end of humans because I'm using personal here, not just to describe humans, but also groups of humans. A family is a person, a city is a person, a company is a person, a government department is a person. All of these aggregations, these assemblages, or as you would say in France, in terms of a more accurate way of describing assemblage is and agencement. Personal data ends up being node-centric. This is where we get personal data vaults from, and data wallets, like the data's got to be at the node. Actually, interpersonal data describes the relationship between people. It sits between us. It's on the edge that connects the nodes. Personal data is very much about control. If there's one thing that's mentioned almost as frequently as data markets and data as property, it's I want to take back control. But control does not scale. If you want to understand that a little bit more clearly, Woody Herzog does a great YouTube video to explain how, when you think about the real-time, huge quantities of data, 4 billion connected people are kicking off. This isn't about control. That just doesn't scale. This is about agency. This is more about a negotiation in the world. This is more natural. This is more how the world works than how we might think in Newtonian ways it might. And unlike the tree-like nature of personal data, which informs our sciences and the way we structure databases, and it's all very neat, and then this is 2 subcategories of a category, it doesn't work like that. Data is just, I guess if you want to think about the data flowing on a coral reef or in a rainforest or just in human culture without bringing digital in it. And you can see that it's not tree-like, it's what might be called rhizomatic, which is a different kind of root structure, which is, well, chaotic, right? This is nature that we're grappling with here. So let's not try and constrain it. Let's not be Newtonian about it, like I say. This is an interesting one. I'll only hover on it very briefly, but in personal data, if you want a personal data store on the node over which you have control, then it's just a facsimile. The master database still resides in the cloud that your bank operates. In the future, your bank, assuming that banks still exist then, Bill Gates, banking is essential, banks aren't, he's got a point. You can imagine that if they choose to maintain a cloud, that will be a facsimile of what sits between us as the master copy on the edge. That's where caching comes in if you're familiar with content address networking. And finally, in terms of comparisons here, personal data, GDPR is enshrined, shaped entirely to serve the dignity of individuals or data subjects in terms of their privacy, whereas interpersonal data is fundamentally about privacy and our ability to make, to gain collective insight, collective intelligence, collective wisdom. We have to attend to that in the architecture of everything we do. So with that in mind, let's look at another slide from a previous SSI meetup webinar. This is, well, first of all, the transition, right? Let's go to the orange circle here. Oh, sweet ego, to be in the middle of my data universe. Like, I can't look at this and not think of some naive imagination of an Ayn Randian atomistic individual, right? The people and societies don't work like this, as any sociologist will attest. Mother Nature certainly doesn't work like this. This is a node-centric, tree-like, simplistic attempt at control. End of. If you want an architectural diagram that I think is representative of where we not only will go eventually, but that we need to go in order to serve the purpose I addressed at the top of this stack. And it looks a little bit more like that, which is a piece of artwork based on the idea of the rhizome that I mentioned earlier. Nature is messy, it's complex, and only, I mean, to paraphrase the law of requisite variety, only complexity can absorb complexity, which brings us neatly to identity. Yes, so let me start this section with my favorite quote from this space, which was by, I think, Phil Windley. I mean, don't you just love that? Of course, we all know Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But right here, Descartes is doubly brilliant. Not only is he able to develop a proposition for existence, no mean feat, but he emphasizes a verb to do so, to think. I like that. And in that vein, here's Andrew, also listing 5 key verbs to do with the process of identifying. Now, while Joe does list the verbs after the nouns in the blog post I linked to from this slide, there is, on my reading of his blog post anyway, little doubt that he senses that identity is a process, not a thing, not a noun. And so it's worth then reviewing, I guess, identity approaches in terms of whether they may be said to be more noun-like or more verb-like. So let's have a look at doing that. On the left, what I call noun-like rigidity, based on properties that just don't change. And on the right, verb-like, correlating, contextual. It's about re-identifying with a certain property in a certain context for a certain. Let's have a look. On the left, here's some key approaches, technologies, ideas, if you like, in the realm of all things digital identity. How do we grapple with it? What do we mean by it? I'm not going to run through these because everyone who watches this will know what I mean by that. I'll come back to private key in a minute. Here's the ones that are verb-like, that are more, dare I say it, human. They allow us psychological evolution. They allow for the complexities of sociology. This is not a bad little list here. On balance, if you want to do some work in identity that's going to do some good in the world, head over to the right side. If you want to live dangerously, and I'll get to that again in a minute, then look to the left side. In fact, you could say that the left is on balance controlling, whereas on the right, we're in the domain of enabling. In other words, everyone working on digital identity is a socio-technologist when you take the last few slides into account. And if there was ever one category of digital technology that couldn't be anything other than socio-technological, digital identity surely is it, right? And yet I meet technologists in this space all the time. And let me give you a story then about that private key that I mentioned I'd return to. I guess I've categorized private key as noun-like on that slide because when I speak to identity technologists, as opposed to socio-technologists, I can't help but think that's how they too often think about it. Similarly, it's these technologists who are attracted to expressions such as solvable in the context of identity. Now that is not something you'd ever hear a sociologist utter about anything, which is why in the description for this webinar, I called out any such people as a danger to society. I mean, just to be clear, I don't want to be dramatic about it, but it needs to be said here. If we get this wrong, people will die. In terms of this socio-technical mix, I found that the episode called The DAO, the DAO, Decentralized Distributed, if you like, Autonomous Organization, known as the DAO in 2016. I mean, it started off with a bunch of participants with this Ethereum innovation who started with the mindset that code is law. Indeed, code is sacrosanct. And yet over the course of 28 days, the opportunity to lose millions of dollars focused their minds. And they concluded that actually the DAO was a socio-technical construct after all, and they could fork it if they decided that they would do so in order to stop the loss of money. Even though it looks like code is law, to some people, it is not. We are doing this for human reasons. In fact, any professional engineers watching this will know that they have codes of conduct that we need to adhere to. And it's with this moral and professional imperative in mind that allows me to move to the next section on all things to be aware of. Here's the first of, I think I've got about half a dozen of these. Let's whip through them. The first to be aware of is the optional becoming the compulsory. And my example, my case study for that is Aadhaar. It is no doubt in my mind that that's where we find ourselves with Aadhaar. It is what started out as an optional biometric-based identity system, to the point where India's Supreme Court has ruled that the balance of interest is better served if registering with the system is optional rather than mandatory. Here we are in 2019, and the few tens of millions left to be registered are being excluded from society. The emergent ecosystem adoption effectively concludes that Aadhaar is compulsory, even though it was said all along by the designers, by the progenitors, by the Supreme Court that it was optional. Again, that's because society works in ways that, in that instance, the technologists and the lawmakers perhaps didn't anticipate. We should also be aware that including is also excluding. They're both derived from claudo, which my dictionary assures me refers to bolting things in, closing them down, locking them up. I was at a conference in Detroit weekend before last, associated with the Radical Markets book that I mentioned earlier, and the topic of global democracy came up. We need a global democracy. You only get a global democracy if you have global citizens. Every global citizen needs to be able to prove personhood and have an identity so they can participate in global democracy. It will just emerge once we've given everyone global citizenship. People will die. There is no other way of putting it. As soon as you make someone uniquely, noun-like, identifiable, that doesn't mean they'll be included in a global democracy. It means just as equally they can be excluded from a data democracy, from a global democracy, and perhaps excluded altogether. Now, there's a lovely chap called H.L. Mencken. Well, I say lovely, there was some parts of him that maybe don't look too good in the 21st century, but at the beginning of the 20th century, he was an American journalist and a satirist. And he observed that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. That's a lovely witticism. And Vlad Zamfir confirms that that's exactly where we find ourselves in the crypto/blockchain space. Lots of people throwing around social theories. It's simplistic, immature. He can sense that the people doing the engineering don't understand what they're doing. Interestingly, someone replied that finding social scientists to engage in this space is really hard because the learning curve is really steep, which of course I couldn't resist, because I had to point out that the reason that crypto techies aren't engaged in sociology is because the learning curve is really steep. Understanding it's really hard. He got the joke because one of the likes is from Bojan, but it just points out here that there are people out there who are sensing the damage that we're about to do, and we need to listen to them. We need to take this on board and point out projects that are doing the wrong things right. Self-interest beats system interest. So on this one, I guess this one is really pervasive and stubborn. It's at the heart of the so-called tragedy of the commons, if you're familiar with that. In this instance, for example, moving reputation from one system to another helps me. Okay, that's self-interest. If I've got a good Uber driver score, that might help me be an Airbnb host. Wonderful. Except that enabling a universal reputation scoring system is dystopian. It's evil. I mean, during the Rebooting Web of Trust conference that Alex mentioned at the top of the hour in Barcelona, this news came out where through China's social credit system, they just decided with a click of a mouse that 23 million people can't travel. Wow, it just blows my mind. Now they've designed it deliberately. I don't think it's a great leap of imagination to think that collectively we might be engineering this emergently. That would be a disastrous outcome. And I know this one is as old as the engineering profession, but no less relevant in this context. We have a moral obligation to make progress, but with care. We're building in path dependencies, and I'll just list Aadhaar again as an example here. Just every time they expose an API, every time a new corporate body or a new government service gets tied into it, it becomes untangleable, if that's a word. It is now. Fundamentally, this is crazy in identity technology. If there is ever a part of the technological landscape where the playbook of moving fast and breaking things is inappropriate, we're in it. And here's the last beware. The frictionist. Beware anyone claiming interoperability. In fact, you'll recall that a slide I shared from a previous SSI meetup earlier about the data marketplace also talked about interoperability, what's not to like. And yet, as the tire not too subtly demonstrates, friction is an important system property. We need to engineer it in. If we don't, we're going to have some very poor social outcomes. And it's actually, funnily enough, quite difficult to engineer friction in technical code. It's going to likely require a blend of legal and technical, which was perhaps the best conversation I had at Rebooting Web of Trust. This is an illustration I did following a conversation with Elizabeth Reyneris, who's Global Counsel at Evonim. And it just, I mean, I'm not going to dwell on this slide because I'm not a lawyer, but what I did take away is that there is no one body of law, no one set of rights, no set of jurisdictional concerns that applies uniquely to digital identity. It's all in the mix. And we need this legal code to work with us in order to prevent some of the outcomes that I've highlighted in this section. Right, I just wanted to demonstrate here that if we get this wrong, if we focus on noun-like rigidity, then as you can see, we're going to squeeze out the verb-like essentials that we need in our societies, that we need for the human condition. This is not a good outcome. We need to fight it. Our psychological development will be challenged. Our sociological dynamics will be challenged. And at the risk of repetition, if we get this wrong, people will die. And if we don't get it right, then the existential challenges will just remain stubborn and people will die, right? I mean, I don't want to put any pressure on anybody listening here, but you know, we've got to get our mojo on. We haven't the privilege just to sit around and navel gaze. At the same time, we can't just move fast and break things. So that's why I'm sending out this clarion call, which, you know, communities such as Rebooting Web of Trust, for example, tries to live up to, which is we need to cooperate. Interdisciplinary cooperation. So I think I've got about half a dozen slides to conclude, which is not too bad timing, I think. So let's, having just dwelt in some miserable outcomes, let's see if we can finish on a more upbeat note, more optimistic, more exciting, if you like. If we get interpersonal data and relationships and digital identity right, we can create the conditions together for the emergence of collective intelligence and perhaps this thing called collective minds. Let me just distinguish mind from brain here, because often they can be used synonymously. A brain is a biological thing, sits in your skull. A mind is not. I'll just read this verbatim, if I may. A mind is not a name for a thing, a substance, but rather a collection of cognitive processes, dispositional states, meaning-making, and behavioral characteristics. It's not easily delimited, and definitely not in terms of what's in your head. Right? This is something palpably different. Don't take my word for it, though. Let's see how Gregory Bateson, one of the greats of information theory and ecology, and anthropology of the 20th century. As Guattari points out here, Bateson showed that what he calls the ecology of ideas cannot be contained within the domain of the psychology of the individual, but organizes itself into systems or minds, the boundaries of which no longer coincide with the participant individuals. Now, he was amongst many in the 20th century who sensed that there are such things as group minds. We've all been in situations, in contexts, where we've just gelled. Gel is a word for, hang on a minute, there was something really special going on there, which is probably the characteristics of a group mind. And the diagram on the left here is just a lovely way to portray it. It's from a book called The Thousand Plateaus, and Mark here has just done some wonderful illustrations to help people understand this potency, this human condition that's sort of been at a subconscious level. We've not been really able to put our finger on it. But in the work that we're doing collectively here with interpersonal data, with digital identity, we can possibly design for it. This would be astonishing. In other words, these three things must come together. They're bounded, they're together, they're just inseparable. And we're focused on collective minds to enhance cooperation so that we can have a more peaceful, sustainable and regenerative future. And if we can work with anyone who's on this call now, or anybody who's watching this after the fact, to try and get this more right than wrong, to try and anticipate the emergent outcomes, to try and codify how we might work interdisciplinarily, how to bring in sociologists, how to bring in psychologists, how to bring in legal experts, then the more of that, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And here's a call to action. It'd be remiss to have an opportunity like this without saying specifically what the AKASHA Foundation is focused on. And it's to do with this socio-technological purview. On the technical side, we're looking at this the interpersonal data architecture. And on the socio side, we're looking at what we call a decentralized data trust. So let me take the technical stuff first in one slide, and then I'll go on to the data trust stuff on my penultimate slide. We'll know interpersonal data architecture when we see it, because it will have these sort of properties. Firstly, the data will surround us. If you want to think again about metaphors, don't think of the cloud, which actually as a metaphor serves us quite well, because it implies it's above us. There's a hierarchy. There's people up there that have domain in the cloud. Us down here don't. When the data surrounds us, it's more fog-like than cloud-like. It's nesting and interpenetrating. There's no clear database tables, no tree-like structures here. This is messy, and yet it could still look as beautiful as this coral reef. It's privacy preserving, because that's essential to human agency. And it's socially meaningful, because that's essential to our cooperation. It's neither individualistic nor collectivized. Now that's the hardest one for me to explain, but but effectively it's not my data, it's not me, but it's not our data, it's not we in that sort of China state that we saw earlier. It's neither of those. It's just unprecedented in the same way that no metaphor serves us well in defining what data is. It's distributed and disintermediating. There should not be, should go without saying, a Facebook type entity sitting at the middle of this. Here's an interesting one. Rather than having this idea that we have some data, maybe someone else can machine it for us and find some intelligence in it, and they should give us a couple of bucks for the privilege. That's just bizarre. The intelligence needs to come to the data to empower each of us, each family, each street, each city, each neighborhood. This is how it should work. This is natural. It's about mutual value creation rather than those property rights that I dismissed earlier. And the conclusion to the blog post, the link of which I stuck in one of the earlier slides, is that it's not that markets can transform personal data, as some people would hope when they say, I want to sell my data. But that interpersonal data can fundamentally transform what we think of as markets. There are associations there with currency, with money, perhaps not in the storage character of money, but more in the flow character of money. Again, happy to talk about that at length if you're interested. And then finally, in blue, because this is the SSI meetup, identity will be contextual, it will be local, it will be verb-like, and digitally co-emergent with interpersonal data. That's really important. So that's the technology, that's the data architecture that we're working on, and would love to work with you on. There's no IP here, just in case you thought otherwise, right? This is just that's just not how this would ever get off the ground. And on the socio side of things, we need human participation. Code by itself is as biased as the people who developed it. So we need to have governance over the coders in order to make sure that algorithms serve everybody in society fairly, justly. So the ODI, the Open Data Institute, defines a data trust as a legal structure that provides independent stewardship of data. In many ways, they're thinking of a situation where a number of companies could pool some data, but they don't want to share it with other companies because maybe there's a bit of competitive issues going on there, but they know collectively there's some intelligence to be mined that they can't do individually. Could they give it to a data trust, and the data trust would be responsible to keep that secure, keep it private, but also to find the intelligence in there. A decentralized data trust in our envisaging entails a decentralized structure, governing again for fairness, but in the social context. You know, we're not designing one operating system for the world. We're not that arrogant. Cultures need to adapt this to their own cultural ways, to give them the facilities for decentralized social sense making of interpersonal data. So as that yin and yang diagram portrayed, interpersonal data architecture and decentralized data trust at two sides of the same coin, if you like, if I want to chuck in another analogy, they're just inseparable. They go together. Thank you. That's the thesis. I've put a link here in terms of where the AKASHA Foundation hangs out. Obviously a link to the blog and a link to the slides being available on ssimeetup.org, of course. And although that URL has got today's date in, give me 24 hours and we'll also have them up on the AKASHA blog too. And I think that was it. Yes, just image credits on the last slide. So thank you very much for listening. And to Alex's points, if there are any questions on any aspect of that, then I'm happy to take any now or indeed afterwards, whichever suits. Thanks again, Alex, for inviting me today.
No, excellent. Thank you so much, Philip. If anyone has any questions, please just jump in and use the question tool or the chat, whatever you prefer. I have a couple of questions. I'm just going to shoot ahead with one or two of them in case nothing else pops up. I mean, I like a lot what you have to say because it's so in contradiction with a lot of things that get talked about in the self-sovereign identity space. And so when you say about interoperability, that it's a danger in itself, a lot of people, I mean, and myself, I see myself talking in that space too, where interoperability is something that is being missed, where it's being kind of positioned as something negative, that systems will not be interoperable. So, from your point of view, how are the ideal things? So I didn't hear it in this presentation. How should things turn out for these identity systems or for these data-to-data systems to be as hopefully they would, so that it would be as beneficial as possible to the people?
Yeah, this is a complex problem to which there are answers that are clear, simple, and wrong. And fundamentally, this is a real issue because it's easier to affect interoperability than to introduce some friction into the system. It's easier to make reputation scores portable than it is to prevent that from happening. Sometimes the code can't preclude people putting the data, putting our identities to purpose that we hadn't intended. which is why I said that we will inevitably be working hand in glove with the lawyers who codify in law the societal norms that have served us well over the decades, over the centuries, and that we wish to protect going forward. So in many ways, this is I don't want to position the lawyers as always putting the brake on, if you like, in that friction way, but however it works, we just need to find a way to make sure that the codes come together, because at the moment the trajectory for digital is that there's so many things that are possible, so many things that can be done, that inevitably someone with some repo somewhere publishes some code that does it. It's almost unstoppable of itself without us having this wonderful thing called law that sits alongside in order to just pull us up in our tracks, because you might not have thought exactly where this is going to lead in 3 years or 30 years, just to balance things out a little bit. So all I can say is, if you're a technologist and you want to work in identity, then start qualifying yourself as a socio-technologist, quick, sharp.
But it's incredibly difficult, because I mean, like, when you think about it, like when we went to rebooting recently, like most of the people are technical, and how do we get these other profiles in?
That's a bloody good challenge. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee, Dame Wendy Hall, Sir Nigel Shadbolt got together. There may have been one or two others in the mix there. Apologies if your name's not coming to my head at the moment. Got together in 2007 and created web science as a discipline, designed from the ground up to be interdisciplinary, because they could see the necessity back then. And here we are 12 years later, and still web science is struggling to attract disciplines where the individual academics, for example, see their career progression more aligned with their silo than with a interdisciplinary epistemology, right? So it is a constant challenge, but the likelihood is, just as we've seen with the emergence of regulations like the GDPR, we've got the e-privacy directive, we've got other parts of the world now thinking, maybe those Europeans are onto something here. Our democratic representatives at some point through the accountability chain will make sure that we don't do ourselves egregious injury. Sometimes it's not evident to them. Sometimes we need to just keep, just pointing it out. I mentioned India several times in terms of their ambitious project, Aadhaar, and the ways that they didn't see in advance of it going wrong. It's our job to help people understand how it might go wrong, because actually there's no one on this call, nobody watching this, nobody involved at rebooting Web of Trust who wants it to go wrong. Of course there isn't. So it's beholden on us collectively to just get in the room with the other non-technologists so that they understand what's possible. In other words, what will be done, not whether it should be done or not, that it will be done, and how we prepare ourselves for that by interweaving our respective codes.
Good. We have Juan, who was also at rebooting, asking here. I would like to ask Philip where publishing and social media fits into AKASHA's vision for the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe together with this, together with AKASHA's vision, maybe you can say what you're planning to do in the short term with AKASHA too.
So AKASHA's been on a wonderful trajectory for the last 3 or so years. Once Ethereum was out in the world, Mihai decided, right, well, this is fabulous. What's the social ramifications for this? How can it more likely create socially valued outcomes rather than the other variety that we've touched on this evening? And so he's designed the AKASHA Foundation to explore just that. And they've been experimenting. They've been trying to work out what is possible. They've been pushing Ethereum, and therefore Ethereum type platforms, to the limits, to anticipate, if you like, a couple of years ahead of time, what things might look like, how we might engineer things towards the purpose that I started this stack with, rather than see things go or follow a different trajectory, not serve that socially valued purpose so well. That experiment has proved interesting. It's a good corpus of code. We've now got a roadmap that spans the next 18, 24 months. Some of the stuff I've described here this evening is underway. Some of the stuff I've described here this evening is not yet underway because we can't do it alone. There is no way that any one organization can do any of this by itself. Sorry, any good chunk of this by itself, but collectively, man, that's exciting. But unlike Facebook's capacity or Google's capacity to get 10,000 engineers all on one payroll focused on making a difference in the world, in this instance, we've got to walk the talk. We've got to cooperate. We've got to share the technologies we've invented to date. We've got to open source them. We've got to discuss the architecture that we need to live up to the socio-technical challenge here. In terms of one specific question about the AKASHA DApp today, it's the distributed app. You could describe it as a social media network, which allows people to share things they find on the interwebs and discuss it in a completely decentralized way. So that's part and parcel of understanding how we can explicitly share data between ourselves. And the interpersonal data vision takes that another couple of stages forward, if you like, which is exploring how all of the data, implicit, explicit, that we kick off just by being in the world these days, might be subject to our agency and extend us as human beings.
Juan is also asking about what you think about self-publishing, not just of content, but also of claims and commerce. And yeah, what are your views on that?
I think people should be everything they can be in the world. I mean, we're all about unlocking human potential. And if part and parcel of that is getting your ideas out into the world, then that should be something that we enable. We are particularly keen to understand how we might, if you like, sometimes I think that a social network is just a centralized construct. It's something we call something when someone else runs it. But we've all, in the decentralized community, envisaged this idea of each of us having a social graph that obviously overlaps with other people's social graphs. And therefore, we've got this emergent, cohering capability where we don't need a mediator to facilitate the sharing of our ideas, our content, our publishing. That should just be part and parcel of being in the world.
Thanks. Jack is asking, sorry, I just had a couple more questions coming in. How do we stop reputation systems from being built on top of any system that is built? Once data is cached, it can be analyzed for reputation scores.
Now, so just to be clear, that reputation has served us really well for millennia, right? You go to any town, any village, and, well, reputation counts. People will do you a favor if they see you doing other people a favor, right? So reputation is part and parcel of trust in society. And if we can't trust our technology, we can't trust ourselves. If we can't trust ourselves, we can't trust each other. And really, that's not going to go anywhere nice. So reputation in the analog world, critical. Reputation in the digital world, critical, because, well, it's now inseparable. However, the reputation that has served us well has been contextual and local, not non-contextual and global. And so the only way that I can imagine stemming the leak, if you like, of data, allowing individuals to serve their self-interest rather than the system interest, which was one of the slides I talked to earlier. The only way I can imagine blocking or disallowing, that's the better word, technologies to enable the emergence of non-contextual global reputation is for there to be laws against it. If anyone's got a technical way of doing it, then please shout.
Great. Jacob, he's saying, great webinar. I'm curious whether or to what extent are the emerging specs of DIDs and verifiable credentials starting to reflect the interpersonal aspects already? And then he's also saying, or to what extent are they capable of accommodating the concerns raised here?
We couldn't contemplate interpersonal data architecture without DIDs. They are and will be core to the technology, but then so will other things like content addressing networks of the IPFS variety or the DAP protocol variety or the SAFE variety. These are sometimes I think actually when you look at the interpersonal architecture, I think perhaps maybe with one or two eureka moments in terms of cryptography, I think we've got most of the components we need. They just need to be assembled in an unprecedented way. So that's really exciting.
Cool. I have one more from Juan. He's saying, have people tried using AKASHA as a self-sovereign crack list?
Ooh, that's a good question. Not to my knowledge. I haven't been involved with the current DAP since it was launched, so perhaps it may have been along the way, but not to my knowledge.
Okay, I just have two more questions for myself then. You were talking about the relationship between money and identity. Could you outline what you mean with that a little bit?
Oh, Alex. Come on,
you know why I'm asking. I'm writing a chapter in the identity book about identity and money. If we do this offline, I really would love to hear what you have to say.
I'll try a 30-40 second response to at least point in the direction of an answer. So if anybody thinks identity is difficult to get your head around, and it is, money is difficult to get your head around. Oh boy. I've had the opportunity to work with Michael Linton over the last few years, who I guess is the progenitor for open money, which you may be familiar with in some towns and cities where they have their own local currency so that it circulates locally and the value doesn't disappear to some corporate entity in another part of the world. And one characteristic of open money is that they emphasize the flow, the verb-like nature of cash over the stocks, the noun-like nature of capitalism. And interpersonal data could share some of those properties such that it could proxy in some ways for the role of open money, which is why I said in the blog post for the Medium publication for Radical Markets that it's not so much whether markets will transform personal data, but that interpersonal data will transform markets. There's a in terms of value exchange, we don't necessarily need currency as we understand it in the fiat sense today in order for that to be affected.
Okay, but I really need you to read my chapter because I've been studying money since 2006, and I would love to hear what you have to say because I mean, for me, like as you just explaining it, there's a clear relationship between the creation of money and how people organize themselves and how identity works. But it's a long subject, as you said. Just one more question.
Please.
Sorry, go.
I was just about to say, I do expand a little bit on it in the blog post for Radical Markets, but I'm also happy to loop in Michael, who is considerably more fluent on all things money than me. He'd love that.
Okay, cool. Now, if people want to collaborate with AKASHA, I mean, I think the challenge that I'm seeing, at least in the market, is that most plays, they tend to be selfish and they try to position their platforms or their own architectures as the leading architecture, and if possible to make it a dominant architecture, and they need to have a monetary system or an incentive system or something to make them to allow them to make a living. So if people collaborate with AKASHA or other companies collaborate with AKASHA, is there like a monetary incentive system for collaboration, or you say like, okay, let's do something cool because this is open source and we all work together, or something different that I haven't mentioned?
This comes down to two ways of looking at the world, which you could describe. I think J.P. Rangaswamy came up with this, or Doc Searls, or perhaps both of them. It's looking at the world in two lenses. One is because of, and the other one is with. So, for example, Apple makes money with iOS. Google makes money because of Android. There's a difference, a fundamental difference there. And do you know which one has got the biggest market share as an ecosystem? It's the because of. And then every time there is a because of in a particular market, the qualities of a because of play outwit, outcompete the with plays. In this instance, I don't think anyway, please shout up if you do think otherwise. I don't think there's anyone in the identity community who thinks that they are going to own identity in, I don't know, in a Microsoft Passport sort of way or a Facebook Connect sort of way. This cannot and will not be owned. Anyone who's anybody in this industry already knows that the protocols will be completely open. Most of the software will be completely open. The services, based on the fact that it will be a distributed architecture, won't allow monetization of mediating services, because there will be no mediation role. So if you're in this space, finding a business model, if you're not a not-for-profit foundation, finding a business model that will serve your investors well is a challenge. That doesn't mean it won't get built. We have TCP/IP, we have www. They're both valuable for everyone because they exist. Nobody made money with them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philip. This was amazing for me. I hope it was also interesting for everyone else. I'll be uploading this material, the slides, the video, and the SlideShare presentation too in the coming hours, or maybe tomorrow morning, depending how the night goes. But you will have it all there. If you want to learn more about what we're doing at SSI Meetup, please follow us on Twitter, go to Telegram, or sign up at the newsletter and the other methods we have to distribute and informing everyone. Next Monday, we will be talking with Myron from San Francisco about the Internet of Things and identity. And he has a very nice slide deck where he explains the relationships and how he sees that future. And that's what we will be talking about next Monday. And then by the end of April, around the 22nd, 23rd, I don't remember the exact date, we will be talking to Lawrence Bundy from Outlier Ventures, where we will be talking about the governance systems that are implied in identity systems and self-sovereign identity. He wrote a really nice article like a couple of weeks ago, and he accepted the invitation too. So those are the upcoming SSI meetups we will be having in the month of April, and there will be more coming the rest of the year. Thank you, everyone. And any final words you want to share, Philip? Or for now,
only my thanks,
so
Alex, for the invitation. I really appreciated it, and I hope to talk to anyone who's listened to this call and have a conversation one-to-one, and then one-to-many, and then let's cooperate. Look forward to it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and have a great night in your case, and for everyone who's in the States, have a great day. All right. Bye-bye.